Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to be reading the next chapter from Red Kayak. The last thing we heard in chapter 23, Brady was with his dad and they pulled the red kayak out of the water. They noticed on the bottom of it that there were holes drilled into it. And Brady proceeded to tell his dad everything that had happened. And that's kind of where we left off the chapter. I'm going to be reading from chapter 24 today out of Red Kayak. Thank you to Priscilla Cummings for allowing us to read this book while we are stuck at home still due to the coronavirus. Here's chapter 24. Would my father ever forgive me for my role in it? The question hovered as the story unfolded. When I finally finished, Dad just sat there, staring at the kayak's wounded hull. Briefly, he dropped his head and covered his eyes with one of his thick, calloused waterman's hands, and I weakened, wondering if, in that moment, if my father would ever even look at me the way he used to. In my whole life, would this ever be behind us? When he brought his hand down, he turned to me sadly. We need to tell the police, Brady. I nodded and I bit my bottom lip. I know. At home, Mom opened her arms to me. It's not your fault, she kept saying. But Dad remained silent as he had all the way home in the boat. While I repeated everything to Mom, he stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the doorway to the living room. Afterward, however, Dad was the one to call Carl to find out who we should talk to at the police department. Carl said not to call anybody until he got there. He came over fast and told us not to go to the police. You need to protect Brady first, Carl insisted. He's right, Dad agreed. We probably need to get a lawyer. A lawyer? You think we need a lawyer? Mom asked, incredulous. Dad nodded. Darn right, Dee, Carl said. You can't just go to the police. They may try to lock Brady up for being a part of this. My mother put a hand up to her mouth. I was in a heap more trouble than she had realized. What do you think it'll cost us? Dad asked Carl. I felt even more horrible then because I knew my parents didn't have hundreds or thousands of dollars to pay for a lawyer. Dad had been saving up for a new truck, and Mom had been setting aside money for college. Carl shrugged. I don't have a clue, he said, but I know it won't be cheap. Darn, I thought. It had never occurred to me that we'd need to hire a lawyer. I swore to myself that I would work hard to pay my parents back, even if college had to wait. Carl recommended an attorney, and more phone calls were made to the lawyer and then to Mom's nursing home, telling them that she wouldn't be in. I stared at the table. I knew this was the deal. I knew it wasn't going to be easy. I just had to remember why I was doing it because it was the right thing to do. And when I remembered that, something deep down inside, something that had been twisted into a tight knot, relaxed just enough so that I could take in a full and solid breath. The lawyer that Carl recommended was named L. Mitchell Anderson. He had an office up in Chestertown, about 20 miles away, so after Carl left, that's where we went that afternoon. A secretary introduced us to Mr. Anderson, and we all shook hands. Come in, make yourselves comfortable, the lawyer said, like we had stopped in for a social visit. He was a handsome guy and a lot younger than I expected, in his early 30s, I would guess, but he was old enough to have a family of his own. Every shelf in his office boasted a picture of his kids building sandcastles on the beach, swinging baseball bats, waving from sailboats. I figured he wouldn't have an ounce of sympathy for what had happened, not if he had little kids of his own. I hoped I hadn't made a terrible mistake by coming forward, but then I recalled all those framed pictures of Ben at the D'Angelo's house. His parents had loved him too, and in my head I heard the hamster's squeaky wheel turning in our basement. We appreciate you talking to us so quickly, Dad said. No problem, Mr. Anderson replied. He indicated for us to take a seat. His nice leather furniture squeaked when we sat down. He offered us all something cold to drink too, but none of us took him up to it. I guess you know basically why we're here, Dad began. Mr. Anderson nodded. Yes, he said, turning to me, but I'd like Brady to tell me the whole story. So, sitting on that slippery couch between Mom and Dad, I went over it all again, including how it was me who months before had suggested we put holes in Mr. D'Angelo's canoe, which gave my friends the idea to steal Dad's cordless drill and sabotage the kayak. But maybe we shouldn't tell the police about it being Brady's idea, my mother said, opening her hands. It was the only time she interrupted. Mr. Anderson held up a finger. It's important for Brady to tell me everything. Mom sat back, although I saw her wince when I described tossing the drill into the creek. I knew I was destroying evidence, I confessed. Mr. Anderson leaned back in his big swivel chair. While I talked, he didn't say a thing or ask any questions. He just took notes on a long legal pad he had propped up on his leg. And when I finished telling him how Dad and I dredged up the kayak that morning in the rain, he let his chair spring forward and he sat, pressing his fingers into a tent in front of his chin. Let's look at this piece by piece, he said. First off, don't be concerned about destroying evidence. They would never have gotten fingerprints off that drill, not after the length of time and with it being exposed to the elements. He made eye contact with Mom and Dad. And then, Dad, he said, and don't worry about Brady. Nothing is going to happen to your son. Mom put a hand on her heart and glanced over at Dad. Mr. Anderson took off his glasses. Just coming up with the idea isn't enough to convict somebody, he explained. It could be considered conspiracy, I guess, but even conspiracy has to include a first step, and that has to include some action, not just talking about a crime. Thank God, Mom murmured. Just to be sure, Mr. Anderson continued, I think we should proffer this information in exchange for the state's attorney's agreement for immunity from protection. I'm sure they'll accept it. They don't have a case without Brady. So it looked as though I wasn't going to get in trouble after all. Still, it was not a jubilant moment, because even if I was never legally punished, I would have to live the rest of my life knowing Ben was dead and that I was partly responsible, along with my friends, who would really be in for it once I finished telling the police what had happened. You look puzzled, Brady, Mr. Anderson observed. No, sir, I said. I'm just worried. I'm worried about what's going to happen to my friends, to Digger and JT. Well, the judge will make that decision, he said. There won't be a trial by jury. No juries in juvenile court. He put his legal pad up on the desk and we looked at one another. It's pretty serious, though. My guess is that your friends will be charged with manslaughter, maybe even second-degree murder. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mom react by putting her hands up to her face. I swallowed hard. Well, which one is worse? I asked timidly, almost not wanting to know. Well, obviously, manslaughter is the lesser of two evils, Mr. Anderson said. The law defines manslaughter as killing someone, but without malice aforethought, which means you didn't intend to harm anyone, like an automobile accident where someone gets killed. Now, second degree murder, on the other hand, means you did intend harm, and even if you didn't mean to kill somebody, a death resulted. Well, will they have to go to reform school? I asked. Now, they don't call it that anymore, Mr. Anderson said, but if they are convicted, they would serve time in a juvenile facility somewhere. How long? I asked. He shrugged. Well, theoretically, the state of Maryland has custody until they're 21 years old. 21? Honestly, I was not sure that I heard that right. The lawyer reaffirmed my question with a nod. 21 years old? Mr. Anderson was gathering up his papers. Dad was standing up. I'd be through with school by the time I was 21, maybe even out of college. Vaguely, I was aware of Mom's hand on my back. Now, guys, I'm going to stop the chapter right there today. We have a little bit more to go in chapter 24, but it was kind of getting long. And so I'm going to hold off and we're going to do that on next week. So I do have a question that is in Google Classroom today, and I'd like you to answer it, and I'd like you to answer it as honestly as you can. I'd also like you to remember to get your homework done. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels and to watch previous chapters of Red Kayak on YouTube. Have a great day. Be safe.